Hello and welcome to our eighth and final installment of the Democracy Dialogue series entitled The Polycrisis of Carbon Democracy, Ideas for a New Global Transformative Social Contract, organized by the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung, Southern Africa. I am Sivuero Kotso, a program manager here at Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung, Southern Africa, and I'll be your moderator for today. So under the Democracy Series Dialogue, we have looked at democracy within the context of a global polycrisis, within the context of post-genocide societies with a focus on Namibia, through the challenges of a post-apartheid state capture in South Africa, and within the realm of faith and politics and their impact on political discourse in Africa. We have also discussed democracy within the context of artificial intelligence and the threat and opportunities that it presents. The worrying rise of far-right politics in Europe and the world, now more so with Trump's election win in the US, and through multilateral groupings such as BRICS and the G20 and the climate question. For today's session, we are focusing on people power philosophies and democracy forged in anti-authoritarian struggles, presented by Dr. Daniel Paget. Now, before I hand over to Dr. Paget, I'll just maybe give a brief bio. Dr. Dan Paget is a lecturer in politics at the University of Sussex. He researches and writes on politics and anti-authoritarian struggle in East and Southern Africa. He has published in the Journal of Democracy, Democratization, African Affairs, Government and Opposition, and Political Parties, among others. He read for his doctorate at the University of Oxford. His most recent publications include The Affinity Between the Rally and Representative Claim-Making, Evidence from Tanzania, and Campaign Rallies and Political Mean-Making, both published in the Journal of Commonwealth and Comparative Politics. He has also published Capitalized Rallies, Why Campaign Costs Are Rising and Rallies Are Hybridizing in Tanzania. And his latest publications within these include The Anti-Authoritarian Populisms, Ideologies of Democratic Struggles in Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and Worldwide. And lastly, Reinterpreting Authoritarian Populisms, Elitist Plebeian Visions of State, published in Political Studies. Dr. Dan, I'm handing over to you. The virtual floor is yours.
Okay, well, hello and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, let me say thank you to Sivué and the Rosa-Luxemburg Southern Foundation for inviting me to come and join the speaker series. I've said all this at some length before the seminar started, so I'll spare Sivué the repeat and give the short version. I was very flattered and pleased to be asked to come and speak to you all, and it's an honor for me to join such an illustrious set of preceding speakers and to speak to an organization I so admire. So, as you, I guess, is apparent from that introduction, I've spent a lot of time working on the politics of Tanzania. That's where most of my research is taking place to date. But that research used to have a fairly different focus for me. I started my academic career focusing on election campaigning, and in particular, the Chama cha Demokrasia na Maendeleo, or Chadema as it's known, in a what's the word? A portmanteau of rather than an acronym of the various words which make up its name. And I used to think of it as an opposition party. I've come since to give more credence to the way it likes to see itself, which is as the institutional form of Tanzania's anti-authoritarian democracy movement. And it's on its ideas that I'll be focusing in this talk. So just to give you a sense of what's coming, I'm going to speak for the best part of half an hour, and then after that, I'll hand back to Sibiwe so he can share a question and answer session. As we're a relatively cozy group, I'll try and keep my remarks brief, and we can get into some of the details more in discussion. So in Chadema's constitution, there's this striking line, and it's stayed with me ever since. So they say that the people of Tanzania has never had a voice, power, and authority over the decisions on the fates of people's lives. From the colonial era and to date. It stuck with me because it's a particularly striking vision of Tanzania's past and present. One in which there seems to me to be one central theme, namely the theme of domination. It's a way of seeing Tanzania and its history of one in which domination is the central theme. Now that quote is from a section of Chadema's constitution entitled "Its Philosophy of People's Power." And as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware, Chadema is not the only opposition party in Eastern or Southern Africa, nor indeed the only movement in the same region or beyond, to identify itself with the cause of people's power. One can see people's power movements across the region, be it in the people's power movements of Bobby Wine in Uganda, until recently called Citizens Coalition for Change in Zimbabwe, and many other movements besides. Now, what I've been drawn to in the study of Chadema's ideas and through the lens of Chadema, other movements like them in the region and beyond, are how they think about democracy, how they envisage what democracy is and what their democratic struggles, as they call them, are, and what they're for. But I've been particularly interested in how their ideas connect to other ideas, and in particular connect to existing or pre-existing academic ideas. And I'm intrigued, and in addition to those two questions, I've been holding in focus in my writings, and I'll hold in focus in this presentation. What can others take from their ideas? What can they learn from it? How can they be inspired by it? So the argument that I've offered in now various writings, and that I'll be rehearsing for you here today, is that Chadema's people power philosophy and others like them closely resembles small r Republican ideas that one can find in academic thought. Now, I want to flag very early on, the small r is really important here for defining what Chadema's ideas are and are not. They are certainly not, I'm certainly not saying that they closely resemble the large capital R Republican ideas that one might, for example, associate with the Republican Party in the United States that has just swept national elections. Instead, my argument is that they are connected to lowercase r Republican ideas, as they're not, that one can see in contemporary academic writings and indeed non-academic writings, and through a long intellectual history. So here's what I'm going to say in the order I'm going to say it. First, I'll say a few words about why it's worth thinking about the ideas of anti-authoritarian democracy movements like Chadema and those of other people power philosophies. Second, I'm going to introduce in short version small r Republican political philosophy as in its recent revival in academia. Then I'll go on to say a little about Chadema's ideas of people power philosophy more concretely and how they relate to those small r Republican ideas. Finally, I'm going to take a step back and make a few remarks about the ways in which Chadema's ideas are both radical on the one hand and moderate on the other. Okay. Oh, pardon me. So why focus on the ideas of a movement like Chadema's, or indeed another people power movement? When it comes to studying anti-authoritarian ideas, my reading of past research and thinking is that past research hasn't seen much to talk about, really. Anti-authoritarian movements are democracy movements. And if you want to ask what are the ideas of a democracy movement, or even what is the ideology of a democracy movement, insofar as they're a common answer, the answer is the clues in the question. Their ideas are democratic ideas. And we know what those are. It's an open and shut case, goes the reading I see in much past research. Where I think that oversimplifies is that it treats democratic ideas as if they were all one thing, as if there was only one version of democratic ideas, as if to say, oh, this movement is democratic, as if that said everything we needed to know. And I think behind it lies an assumption and a context which has shaped that assumption. The context, of course, is the liberal moment, the post-Cold War moment of liberal ascendancy. The assumption is that democratic ideas means liberal democratic ideas. And I think that's not enough. It's not enough to say of anti-authoritarian movements like Chadema that they simply articulate democratic ideas, nor is it enough to say that they articulate liberal democratic ideas for these three reasons. Firstly, liberal ideas aren't all alike. Liberal thought isn't homogeneous. The liberal canon is incredibly rich and diverse and wide. There's lots that one can see in that canon. And going beyond that, of course, liberal ideas about democracy, prominent, dominant perhaps as they may be, are not the only ideas about democracy. And in saying that, I'm not simply trying to push us towards ideas of, for example, one-party democracy or other sets of ideas which have claimed the mantle of democracy, but in practice instituted systems that one might think of as one way or another as authoritarian. I want to open up the space to recognize the diversity of genuinely democratic ideas that can be articulated, and as I'll say in a few moments, are being articulated in Tanzania and Africa and beyond. But even putting aside those ideas, those objections, there's another. Even if an organization was signed up to a full liberal democratic manifesto and a conception of what democracy is, ideologies are about making sense of one's circumstances. They're about forming an interpretation of the world, and finding one's place in it. It's a way of orienting oneself in an action-facing way. And liberal democratic theory doesn't offer much help to someone trying to make sense of authoritarian circumstances. Liberal democratic ideas have been articulated, at least in their academic forms, principally in so-called liberal democracies. They've been articulated outside of authoritarian context, and their concerns and priorities have not been how to make sense of authoritarian circumstances, but instead to address questions such as what is liberal democracy? What are the best arguments for it? What form should it take? How should it be revised and instituted? And those questions are all important, and democracy movements in authoritarian states might be concerned with any number of them. But it doesn't give them much sense. It doesn't give them much guidance about how, for example, to critique the authoritarian regimes under which they find themselves, or indeed how they should act, or what they should demand of each other, and how they should conduct themselves. Put simply, academic ideas about liberal democracy in the liberal canon leave democracy movements in authoritarian states with a lot of intellectual improvising to do. And so it's in light of those concerns that I want to take seriously and ask thoughtfully, what are the ideas being articulated by Chadema and other people power movements? So I said that my position, my argument is that there are various resemblances between Chadema's political thought and the political thought of small r Republican political theory as it's articulated in the academy. So let me say a few words to introduce that body of theory. Now, listen, this is going to be a very short and therefore very inadequate history or introduction, history and introduction to Republican theory. I'll do my best. And there are various ways I could introduce it that look far back into history and indeed ancient times. But I'm going to offer an introduction which charts the revival of small R Republican ideas in the academy. So for anyone who doesn't have the same predilection as I do for changing intellectual fads and currents in academia, please bear with me. So for a long time now, an incredibly long time, there have been fundamental debates about what freedom is. And I'm sure that one way or another, many of you have come across them. In fact, seeing the negative versus positive freedom line on this slide, I imagine that some of you, maybe perhaps all of you, are rolling your eyes and thinking, not this again. That's certainly how I feel about this debate. I feel it's been done to death. Now, that debate, of course, within the liberal canon was about how to conceptualize what freedom is and whether it should be conceptualized in negative terms as the absence of constraints or in positive terms as the ability to. And where one stands on that question has radical implications for what states should be like and what they should do, whether they should get out of the way or whether they should get into the business of interfering in society in order to preserve people's autonomy or equip them with the capabilities they need in order to be free. The revival of Republican ideas in modern political philosophy begins in the 1990s with a revival of an alternate conception of what freedom is, and therefore an alternate answer to those questions about the state and society. And it begins with the idea of domination. Domination conceived of as the subjugation of one over another, the same sort of domination that exists that a master exercises over a slave, like a complete and arbitrary power. And the idea emanating from a rereading of historic ideas running back to Cicero and being revived in the English Civil War and beyond, is that freedom can be conceptualized neither as negative as the absence of constraints, nor as positive abilities, but instead as non-domination, the absence of domination. That one is free when one no longer has a master, and that collectively, when we rule ourselves as a democracy, we are free only when we do not collectively have a master. It's about the absence of others' arbitrary power over us. Freedom is the absence of such arbitrary power. And so these ideas are revived first by Dennis Skinner, a political historian, but then by Philippe Petit, who offers a rereading of liberal democratic systems as systems which deliver such non-domination. For him, the liberal constitutions we enjoy, what they offer is a system of checks and balances and institutional rules which ensure that no one is dominated, by ensuring that the power of the state has to track the interests of those they rule. So that's how Republican ideas were reintroduced into the academy through the 1990s. But within Republican thought, an important second layer of ideas has emerged in the last, depending how you look at it, the last 5 years or the last 15 years or so. And it's developed a split within small R Republican thought between what I'm going to call, following Camilla Vergara, on which more in a second, between neo-republicanisms, small r, republicanisms, and radical, small r, republicanisms. And the differences between these ideas go back to fundamental questions about what sorts of domination are being guarded against and prevented. From whom does one have to be free from domination in order to qualify as free under that conception? And what sort of political system is endorsable or justifiable in light of the answer to that question? To put it, to make these ideas a little more concrete, I'll introduce you to two radical Republican thinkers who depart in one way or another from the ideas of Philip Petit and those that preceded him, that I've been particularly influenced by and who I think are particularly important. One is Dr. Camila Vergara of Chile, but who works and teaches about 100 miles away from me here at the University of Essex. So in her first book, which came out 2 years ago, she proposes that we widen the conception of domination that Republicans have thought about before. For her, authors like Philip Petit are really concerned with tyranny. Domination is tyranny. Domination by one person, or perhaps domination by the majority through the leadership, or the governmental leadership of one person. Tyranny by an individual, or tyranny by a tyrant, if you like, or tyranny by the masses. And what she wants to put back in our field of vision is oligarchic domination, domination by the few. And the conception of systemic corruption, which she proposes, which is the title of her book, is one in which institutional rules, perhaps even the very institutional rules designed to prevent domination, are circumvented, and in which the few, be they a distinct selection of small people or some more inchoate network of people, can collectively undermine those rules, capture the state, and so exercise their domination over society and rule in their own interests. That for her would be systemic corruption and oligarchic domination at the same time. So she wants us to think about different sorts of domination, therefore different sorts of institutions that one might need to guard against it. And secondly, I'd like to introduce the ideas of Daniel Allen, writing from the United States and publishing her book, Justice by Means of Democracy, last year. And what she adds to the radical Republican ideas of Camila Vergara, in short, are firstly that we need to recognize all the other sets of ideas, all the other ideologies, especially not least in the 20th century, that don't call themselves small r Republican, but nevertheless share a small r Republican's preoccupation with domination, especially when referred to as oppression or subjugation. And so she sees various sorts of movements and ideologies of the 20th century against colonialism, against patriarchy, against racial domination, as all, in one way or another, anti-domination movements, and therefore movements which add something to the vision of if you like, the imaginary of domination that we might share, the varieties of domination against which one must guide. And she puts best that democracy is only a democracy when the people are not dominated. That if democracy is the people collectively ruling themselves, then it can only be achieved when in the absence of domination of the people. To put otherwise, non-domination is essential to democracy, and that means the absence of oligarchic domination and patriarchal domination and racial domination and colonial domination are all essential to the realization of democracy. So, to take a step back, Camila Vergara and Daniel Allen and others are using the same concepts as the neo-Republican thinkers before them, principally domination and power, but trying to widen our view of the forms that domination takes. And in light of that, what they say is we need to rethink how we design our democracies in order to secure freedom from all these sorts of domination. I've always been particularly taken by this quote since I first read it. It's from Camilla Vergara's, not her book, but her doctoral thesis, which of course nobody ever reads. No one reads a doctoral thesis, but I read hers, and this really hit me, and I've carried around this idea ever since, that she wants to begin from the premise that liberal democracy, as any political regime throughout history, is flawed and perfectible. But otherwise, we can make our democracies better. We don't need to think of the institutional forms that they commonly take today as the end of the conversation about the forms that they should take. We can make our democracies better. And so she and Daniel Allen and others are proposing a variety of changes to the institutional systems that we see as crucial to our democracies, be that through the introduction of a new legislative branch, which is, to use, again, Camilla Vergara's terms, plebeian, selected by lots or by lottery in the way that juries commonly are. Or whether that involves, again, this is one of Vergara's ideas, a network of popular assemblies, or whether that includes some of the variety of ideas that Daniel Allen proposes in the report entitled Our Common Purpose, published in 2020 or 2021 in the context of the United States. Crucially, these authors don't accept the reading of Philip Petit that the liberal democracy's current form is the form which secures us from domination. They want to say, no, the liberal democracies we live in today are strewn, they're riddled with various intersecting forms of domination. We need to think radically about how we change them in order to guard against domination. So that's on Republican ideas. Now I'm going to turn and say a few words about how the concrete people's power philosophy of Chadema stands in relation to those ideas. Now, as far as I'm aware, Chadema and its thinkers and its leaders aren't reading these same works. They're not drawing directly on any of these ideas, not least because, of course, their ideas precede many of them. But there are a number of important resemblances between them. Now, I should say to start with, as some of you may know, Chadema in Tanzania it's a right-wing organization. It's always been a right-wing organization. Its founder and founding leader, Edwin Mtei, used to work for the World Bank in the 1970s and 80s. He used to be the governor of the Central Bank of Tanzania. They were, commonly understood as Thatcherites or Reaganites, or people in that. They believed in markets and deregulation and small states. But Chadema's ideas, at least the way that Chadema spoke in public and the way it mobilized people to its cause, changed in the first decade of the new millennium. It changed under the leadership in particular of its third chairman, Freeman, and current chairman, Freeman Mbowe. He might just be able to see wearing a red cap on stage on the picture on the right-hand side of this slide. And it's not as if they walked away from any of those ideas I mentioned, but on top of them, they began to privilege this people of power philosophy, which now occupies a separate section in their constitution alongside their ideology, and which stands above it, literally in the documents. And in it, they single out domination. They single it out as the common and the dominant theme in Tanzanian history, as I showed you in that quote at the top of this presentation. And their critique of Tanzania today is that Tanzania is dominated, and it's dominated through the means of an authoritarian state, that the ostensibly liberal democratic constitution of Tanzania is a thin veil for what is ultimately an authoritarian system. And they see that authoritarian system as the root cause of popular hardships in Tanzania today. If you listen to how they talk and read their speeches, as I do, you'll see that they identify any number of popular hardships as ultimately caused by the systemic corruption that emanates from those from that domination. The Tanzania is ruled in the interest not of the majority or of its population, but a small oligarchic selection of leaders and those behind those leaders. In perhaps the most iconic articulation of these ideas by the former Secretary General Wilbrod Slaa in 2009, he announced what he called a list of shame of a small number, of which he went on to name a small number of presidents, former presidents, prime ministers, and cabinet members, past and present, who were the crux, he said, of a network that ruled Tanzania in its own interests. So if that was their critique, their diagnosis of Tanzania's problems, they also had a distinctive prescription. They had a set of ideas for how to fix Tanzania. And to sum it up in 2 words, the way that they, to this day, sum it up in 2 words is as Katiba Mpya, new constitution. They see a new constitution as the key to ridding Tanzania of that domination, breaking that domination, stymieing, therefore, that oligarchic state capture, corruption, and thereby relieving the hardships suffered by the people. So in all those respects, the foregrounding of domination and ideas about oligarchy and capture and the centrality to the idea of popular power they give, the centrality they see of constitutional change which secures popular power, their ideas resemble and productively speak to small Republican ideas, including as they're articulated in the academy. There were just a few things I want to say, and I realize, Sibiwe, I'm now running to time.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay, well, this is my final words, and this is my last substantive slide. That these ideas change subtly following the election of President John Pombe Magufuli in Tanzania in 2015, who, as no doubt many of you know, oversaw a long-running authoritarian turn in Tanzania up until his death in March 2021. And the way that Chidema spoke changed in those years. The focus on oligarchy, on a shadowy network that extended beyond the state to rich and elite interests, fell out of focus. And the man himself, John Pombe Magufuli, came into focus. It became less a radical critique of oligarchic capture and more a sort of neo-Republican critique of neo-state capture. It was a critique of a tyrant rather than an domination by an oligarchic group. And even if one looks before the election of Magufuli, if one dug into Chidema's vision of what that new constitution looked like and how it would deliver domination, it sounds very familiar, and it more closely resembles the ideas of Philippe Petit, and it's much more conventional. Really, it amounts to crucially, they're interested in reducing the power of the presidency, of decentralization, of strengthening parliaments, and thereby breaking up the concentration of the powers in the executive, which they see as the center of state capture. Now, all those things might be true, but what they don't address are some of the worries articulated not least by the small R radical Republican thinkers I've referred to about what can checks and balances achieve. Because if one looks to the liberal democracies, the so-called liberal democracies in the world today, many of them are designed to incorporate checks and balances on power. They divide powers between different branches of government. And yet many of them are also encumbered by some of the sorts of intersecting forms of domination that Republican thinkers write in critique of. And so it's in that sense that one might see for Chadema and those who share their ideas a warning in the insights of radical Republican thought, and it's in this mixture of things in Chadema's ideas and the ideas of others like them, that this in some way searing critique of authoritarian domination, state capture, a radicality to those ideas, a radicalness, but also in the conventionality of the ideas they propose, sort of a James Madison-esque system of checks and balances, a sort of moderateness, and a prescription which amounts to advocating for a constitutional arrangement which is the status quo across much of the world today. So those are the things I wanted to say. I've introduced the small R Republican ideas, why it's important to think about anti-authoritarian ideas, the people's power philosophy of Chadema, and the elements of moderality, or moderalis, is that a word? Moderateness and radicalness in their ideas. Thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Dan, for that. We will be now moving to the question and answer session, the Q&A. So just for the audience, please submit your questions, concerns, or comments in the Q&A box, or alternatively, raise your hand. I'll then allow you to speak. But while we're waiting for that, I'll just maybe open with two questions for you, Dr. Paget. And it seems maybe that you have partially answered these questions in your presentation. So maybe I'll just modify them a bit. And the first relates to the people power philosophies. So is this something that's unique to Tanzania? Or do we find examples of such ideologies elsewhere in the continent, elsewhere in the world? And then the second relates to your idea of homegrown republicanism. So you've explained that this really is different from contemporary Republican thought associated with parties like the Republican Party in the United States, right? But what does this look like in other contexts that are not Tanzania or Zimbabwe, and who's mainly responsible for such ideologies? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Silue. And listen, I'm interested to hear everyone's questions and reactions. And so I'm looking forward to them. In answer to those two questions, so to begin with, you asked about the people power philosophies beyond Tanzania and Zimbabwe. There's a lot to say about that in regards to both Tanzania and Zimbabwe and beyond. So of course, people's power must be one of the most common rallying cries and slogans across not only Tanzania and Zimbabwe, but indeed so many other movements from the colonial era to date across Africa, especially in Africa perhaps, but also beyond. What could be a more universal rallying cry? So to speak of people's power per se, alone, perhaps doesn't amount to much of a resemblance between with Republican ideas. But to see popular empowerment as crucial to democracy, I think does begin to resemble Republican ideas. And to elaborate on why, it's important, I think, to realize how much the concept of power gets marginalized in liberal thoughts. If you read liberal texts and analyses of liberal texts, you'll see how much that concept is pushed into the background, and how instead ideas about procedure and civility and process are foregrounded. Accountability is probably the closest that core liberal texts get to seeing something like power as essential to democracy, but that's in some ways such a limited version of popular power, and I think it excludes some of the other forms it can take. So whenever I think what Danielle Allen would say, and I'll try and articulate her position, is that whenever one encounters a movement that sees popular empowerment as crucial to the realization of democracy and sees current liberal democratic systems as inadequately empowering people, then that strikes me as some core Republican ideas, small R Republican ideas. You asked also about republicanism and its forms elsewhere. Listen, ultimately, this is going to be such a researcher's and an academic's answer. Ultimately, these are open questions to which does merit empirical investigation. And so I don't have the answers. I don't have the empirical answers to them. But having said that, if I were to speculate a little, what I would remark is firstly that the authoritarian context in which Chadema and the democracy movement in Zimbabwe, formerly known as the CCC, speak, I think are crucial to the way they've ended up thinking. I think that focusing on domination and state capture and systemic corruption and people's power are ways of thinking that make an awful lot of sense given their circumstances. I mean, if everyone, the forms of domination that they face are so naked and pronounced, that when I hear the ideas, I think, of course, these are the ways that one would choose to think, and these are the prescriptions, these are the critiques that one would articulate, and the prescriptions that one would propose in those circumstances. So speculatively, I would not be surprised if ideas about domination and state capture and people's power and are not particularly common to democracy movements in other authoritarian circumstances too. So on the Republican, the U.S. Republican Party, I'll say very quickly that, and I owe this insight again to Daniel Allen, that if one looks back to the thought of the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln, who of course was one of its core leaders when it was formed in the mid-19th century. So they do articulate ideas about domination and democracy. So there is a shared heritage, even if one has to look back almost 200 years to find it. Okay. Sibiwe, I hope that's at least a good beginning of an answer to your two questions.
Yes, it is. Thanks, Dan. So I'll just open it up to the floor now. Please share your questions, your comments, and your thoughts on Dr. Paget's presentation and the topic at large. Okay, so I see Janine raised a hand, so I'll just maybe allow her to speak. Hi, Janine, please go ahead.
Thank you. And I guess you can hear me, but you can't see me, and I cannot. I'm not able to. But anyhow, you can hear me. I think that's more important than seeing me.
Yes.
So thank you very much for the presentation. It was really very insightful, and I've learned a lot. I have a question. Maybe it is too specific. I'm not sure, but I tried, and you can just let me know what you think about it. You mentioned this slogan that a new constitution is key. And for obvious reasons, constitutions are very important here in South Africa. I mean, I'm sure you know the saying that it is actually the best constitution in the world, but implementation sometimes is a little bit difficult. So, I mean, that's an obvious thing. But then one thing is, I mean, constitutions are not only but often about basic rights. If we now look at what constitutes people's lives, then I think it is more often concrete. For instance, the need to housing. And even if one can derive certain issues from basic rights, like I'm sure you will be able to derive the need to decent housing from other basic rights, but it still is a little bit different to talk about like a thing like right to housing. And I think there's also some kind of domination issue in that topic, because you have the landlords dominating the tenants. And I mean, it is a critical issue like almost everywhere in the world. And I think it is also very central to also democratic procedures and so on, because people, they need some trust in the society, and that also means that they have adequate housing. So my question really is like, how do you see this, what your research is about, and in relation to the question of domination, and also the importance of constitutions and so on? How do you see that in relation to particular struggles like the right to housing, the right for water, and yeah, things like that?
Okay, Sibylle, should I answer these questions one by one? Is that best?
Yes.
Okay. Janine, I really like your question. I tell you what I particularly like about it is that I think you articulate the objection to the idea of constitutional solutions to or the limits of what constitutions can do to deliver all the concrete things and the material and the beyond the material things that everyone needs and wants. This objection is one that I hear echoed in some of the radical Republican ideas I was referring to. So to be candid, my research on Johanesburg and other people power philosophies movements, I think, doesn't have much to say concretely to this. But what if I can be a channel or representative for radical Republican theory for a moment? I think the way that they would rephrase your objection, Janine, is that liberal constitutions haven't done much and can't do much for issues such as housing, or there is the things that they could do have been undermined and circumvented by a variety of powerful interests which have blunted the what could be done through those liberal democratic constitutions. The reason that they would give is that these systems have been prone to various forms of capture and oligarchic capture. That the reasons that there are one of the reasons that there are housing problems and relationships indeed of private domination between landlords and tenants, for instance, are that better things haven't been done because the policies that we call liberal democracies have been become the servants to the interests of the wealthy and the interests of landlords. So I think what they'd say is that yes, liberal constitutions do not deliver on many of these things. They leave many of these problems unsolved. But what the question they want to reopen is, how can we change those constitutions in order to realize the empowerment of people which democracy is supposed to fulfill? I think that they want to say that there might be better constitutions which better empower people and therefore make our democracies more perfect and better, and therefore might lead to resolutions to these problems. The title of Danielle Allen's book is Justice by Means of Democracy. She wants us to reconceptualize democracy as the ultimate pathway by which we can achieve whatever the materials changes that we want are. It has to be by means of a system in which we all rule ourselves. And she wants us to reopen the question of how do we design those systems so that enduring inequalities like those of between landlords and tenants can be addressed. So I think that's in some ways an answer to your question, in other ways not. I think that's the best I can do, but I'd be very happy to say more on the subject. Sibylle.
All right, thanks, Daniel, for that. I'm sure Janine is happy with the response. But yeah, we are just maybe also waiting for other questions, comments from the audience? Okay, I see Joshim has raised the hand. Let me just allow Joshim. Hi, Joshim. I think you can unmute now.
Yeah, okay, my brother.
I'm good. Thanks to you, man.
Good. Greetings from Nigeria. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, you can go ahead, Joshim.
Yeah. Listening to Dr. Paget, in fact, I sort of got confused, not necessarily from the point of view of his presentation, but for the fact that one becomes angry when you see drawing from his presentation and the reality on ground, especially in my own part, and not only Nigeria, almost all African countries now, you see some of these basic philosophies and ideals that Dr. Paget drew from the academia. I see them lacking in many of our countries, that we begin to question ourselves, where is the place of ideology in our democratic and political processes? Because take a case of Nigeria, you see a political party today, you hardly know the ideology, you hardly know the principle, you hardly know what this political party stands for. In the case of Tanzania's Kadima, as as Dr. Paget uh, narrated, it's clear. You know what it stood for. In my own context here in the Nigeria and in some African countries, you hardly know what political parties actually, they are in this party today, they belong to the other party tomorrow, they dine and wine with the other party, that they don't even believe in some of the things, whether constitutionalism, whether it's rights, freedom, non-domination, and some of those core values that we have just been introduced to, flowing from the experience from the Tanzania's Kadima. So my question, simple, is how do we really, because it's not only state capture, including the people power has been taken away. How do we really return this power back to the people? What can we do from the point of view of ordinary citizens? Thank you.
Thank you for those reflections and all of that context from Nigeria as you see it. So how can listen, I guess I have maybe three sorts of reactions. Three things come to my mind in light of what you said, and I don't how good an answer there will be to your question, I guess I'll leave for you to judge. I guess the first is that, so one of the things I find myself doing in my work a lot is trying to see ideas where others have not seen ideas. See ideas being articulated by political actors in my context in Tanzania and Zimbabwe, but also elsewhere. So the notion that that ideologies are in some ways absent or just used instrumentally or just paid lip service to is what well founded in Tanzania and Zimbabwe and indeed elsewhere. And so one thing I try and do in my research is take more serious, listen more carefully to I mean in my case the people power movements, as they call themselves in the region, but also elsewhere and on the streets, and look for ideas that might not be presenting themselves as a coherent set of ideas, and try and see ideas where they haven't been seen before. So I can't pretend to know the ideas of the politics of Nigeria, so I can't comment on the specifics therein. But I guess what I can share is an optimism that in fact people are working with political ideas and are shaping their own sorts of critiques of the states around them more often than one might imagine. Certainly more often than academics like myself have recognized. But in more direct answer to your question, I think the only answers I can give you are platitudinous ones, are in some ways truistic ones that will be obvious to you. That if one wants to know how one can address issues of domination or state capture in any given place, there is no simple answer. There is no silver bullet. There is only the hard, grueling, and slow work of political activism. But when it comes to how should our policies themselves be designed, and how should they be reformed to deal with some of the issues you're describing? Perhaps the central thing that the radical Republican theorists I've been describing a little would say is, let's reopen the question, and let's not take the precise constitutional forms that liberal democracy has crystallized into being over the last 100 years as the only form that they can take. Let's rethink the way we design our constitutions and our systems. Let's not think that it would be that these systems are sacrilegious, that they cannot be reformed, and that they cannot be improved. If you want to think about more concrete ways in which they can be reformed, well, I mean, I can refer. The best I can do, I think, is refer you to the authors and the ideas that I mentioned. If you Google our common purpose report, I mean, you'll see a document packed of ideas, albeit in the context of the contemporary United States, that are trying to shake loose some of the institutional format of democracy in the United States and think about feasible ways it can be improved there. And I guess it would be an open question and one for you to judge about how many of them might be applicable somewhere like your own home country of Nigeria. Over to you.
Thank you, Dan, for that. I think one important aspect from this question from Joachim is that it leaves open a lot of room for critical reflection, right, on what the political ideologies and the positions and stances of the various political parties in other electoral regimes in Africa look like. Because I think this is a genuine concern to raise that they are unknown in countries, say, for instance, like Nigeria, whereas in Tanzania, you can clearly point them out. And in this case, you have, right? So I think this is a very important point to note from my end, at least, and for research purposes, because it really it would help elucidate some of the context in which some of those parties are formed in these countries, right? And their legitimacy, speaking to what you have noted, Daniel, in some of your articles, is a question of mandate, legitimacy, right? And whether or not democracy is a means or an end to achieve these goals that are centered on people power philosophies. So I think, thank you so much for that, Joachim. And thank you, Daniel, for the response to that. I'll just ask maybe one last time if we do have another question or comment from the audience regarding some of these questions, and maybe some aspects of the topic or the discussions that you feel maybe also deserve some reflections, critically so, on. Okay, so it seems we might not have any questions now. So from this, I will just maybe proceed to close the discussion and start by thanking very, very quickly our audiences for joining, not just for this session, but through the entire Democracy Dialogue series, especially those who've been with us from the first inaugural session that covered the polycrisis of democracy, and of course through the other sessions as well that were very specific in their focuses. But also a thank you to our colleagues here at Rosa-Luxemburg, our sister offices as well, for helping circulate our events as we had and as they approached. And again, thank you to our colleagues here, Fredson, Gileng, who was unfortunately not able to join for this last session, Janine, Walter, our office director, who has been very supportive and very engaging in our sessions throughout the series, as well as some of our other colleagues who are not able to join as well, but have helped in chairing some of these sessions, and they are Refile Jwala, Siko Lutangwe as well. And I'd like to thank you again, Dr. Daniel Paget, for honoring us with your presentation for today's session on what truly has been a nuanced discussion. At least for me, it has been the first time attending or participating in this people power philosophies topic. So thank you again, and thank you to everyone. What I think I'll take away from this session is that there is room for critical reflection on certain questions and aspects that are related to the topics that we discuss on a daily that are related to democracy, right? And this is encouraging to the extent that we can always move forward with discussions. We can always have spaces open for critical thinking and reflection on issues related to democracy as they are ongoing, as they're moving forward. So again, thank you to everybody. Thank you, Dr. Dan, again. And we look forward to more discussions around democracy moving forward from next year, of course, seeing that this is the last one for this year. So thank you again, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Siviwe. The honor was mine. And thanks to everyone for attending. If anyone wants any of the papers I've written but can't get access to them, email me and I will do everything I can to give you access to them. Yoshim, I thought there's a book by someone called Portia Roloffs entitled Good Governance in Tanzania, which maybe sees some of those missing ideas that we were talking about. Let me know if you want help getting access to it. Thank you, everyone, and bye-bye.
Thank you.